Hello and welcome to the Spike podcast. I'm Fraser Myers, and back with me this week we have Spike's editor, Tom Slater.
Hello.
And Spike columnist, Ella Whelan.
Hi.
Coming up on the show, the crackdown on Republican protesters, the Ukrainian fight back, and the madness of Mermaids. So since the death of Queen Elizabeth last week, there's been something of a concerted crackdown on Republican dissent, I think it's fair to say. There have been several protesters who've been arrested and charged, sometimes with this kind of archaic breach of the peace law. We've had people holding up signs saying, fuck imperialism, abolish monarchy, being arrested. Someone was arrested and de-arrested for saying essentially that Charles wasn't elected. Someone's been arrested and charged for heckling Prince Andrew. Tom, what have you made of this? I mean, that's just a tiny sample, actually, of some of the kind of crackdown that's been going on.
It is. I think probably concerted crackdown might be putting it a little bit too firmly, but nevertheless, there's obviously been these bunch of cases which are very concerning and really show how, given the police have such discretionary power in this particular area, that as soon as there is a kind of mood of very firm consensus, as there has been, in relation to National Act of Public Mourning and all the rest of it, that you see these instances of overreach, and not just once, but twice and three times. I mean, there's been a kind of string of cases which have been really shocking on their own terms and therefore really should raise the hackles of anyone who cares about freedom of speech. As you were saying, 2 people in Edinburgh actually arrested and charged with this breach of the peace. There was the man in Oxford who was arrested and then de-arrested, like you say. The guy in Westminster, the young barrister, who was threatened with arrest for holding a blank piece of paper on which he had threatened to write, "Not my king." And as a consequence of this, the police officer said it may offend people. And as I say, very narrowly escaped getting arrested in that case. I mean, this is absolutely ridiculous. But I think it speaks to a kind of a much broader problem, which is that for some time now, whether it comes to freedom of speech, but also where it comes to protests as well, the police have very broad powers. They've been broadened even further still in recent months. And so as a consequence of that, you're leaving what is a fundamental liberty in the hands of individual police officers who have wide scope to abuse the powers that they have. So that's something that I think, regardless of where you come out on this question, has to be taken very, very seriously. It's not the only time this has happened. I think some people are trying to pretend like this is just a function of kind of post-Boris Johnson authoritarian Tory rule, which is 100% not
the Policing
the case.
Act is to blame or something like that.
Exactly, which is actually quite misleading in the sense that none of these people were charged, arrested under that particular act. It's older pieces of legislation. The 2 people who are actually charged in Scotland, it's under a completely different piece of 2010 legislation, incidentally. But nevertheless, this is a problem and we need to deal with it because it's been building up for decades, these kinds of powers, not just in the course of the last government.
Yeah, I mean, Ella, this is, nothing new. We live in a country where it's something north of 3,000 people a year are arrested, particularly just for saying things online. People are taken away by police or stopped by police from protesting too vigorously and things like that. This is just a serious problem in general.
Yeah, I suppose if you want to see a silver lining to what is kind of very, sort of distressing thing to see, which is that people getting yanked around for, as Tom says, holding up blank bits of paper or even shouting who elected him outside a church in Oxford, is the fact that, it brings home the importance of free speech to a lot of people. And as Tom is right in saying, there's quite a fair few hypocrites on social media at the moment saying, where are the free speeches now talking about the Queen? It's like, hello, we, join the party. We've been saying this for a very, very long time. If you're upset about police accosting people protesting the monarchy, then you should also be upset about people being arrested for tweeting about, gender critical issues or things like that. Come join us now that you've seen the light of how important free speech is.
They're not going to join us, though.
That's the one thing.
Which was,
you can try.
They didn't even try to pretend that they'd had some Damascene conversion either, because as you say, the commentary from the sort of woke left, shall we say, was just, where are all the free speeches now? Even though we were all there condemning it more strongly than they would, because they're fundamentally just interested in a gotcha with this particular issue. But it is striking how upset people on that side of politics are at a handful of arrests, given the fact that, as you point to, Fraser, literally thousands of people have been arrested for online speech. It was 3 and a bit thousand in 2016 alone. We've seen it carry on since then. And so, even if we're being generous, I think the most these people are defending at this point is the freedom to vigorously agree with them in public.
Yeah.
And that's all they've ever really been that interested in. That's why they don't really care about this particular.
That's why they still use the word, they still write free speech in quote marks, as if free speech is not really a thing. Or, free speech is only really about defending bigots and racists and your right to say horrible stuff.
I suppose the important new development is that what has become the kind of new way in which the police enforce these kind of laws or have this kind of authoritarian action is that it's through the language of offence, which, previously you would have just sort of been like, that's the law, shut up. But with the case of the guy in Westminster who was sort of testing the law by coming out with the blank piece of paper, he said to the police officer, he was sort of filming it, what am I doing? Who am I, what law am I breaking? All that kind of thing. And the police officer kind of said, oh, well, I don't know, someone might get offended. And actually somebody high up in the police came out and said, look, that, it's not illegal to protest. One of the problems we have here is that there are individual police officers who do not understand that they're not allowed to crack heads over posters and chants. And, this doesn't just extend to what's happening kind of in and around Westminster or at vigils and things like that. It's, we've seen in the news that both Celtic fans and Rangers fans, for example, at football matches are being threatened with fines for either holding up signs saying, F the monarchy or playing the national anthem. And there is, it's becoming extremely hard to maintain the kind of performance of a polite Republican at the moment because, there is this, it reminds me of the pandemic actually, which is that when there are big things happening, whether it's like don't question the science or mourn the Queen, that there is this sort of automatic drive to censor any kind of, not just disagreement, but anything that's sort of like, even in this instance, a bit distasteful, heckling coffins and all that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And that's the sort of new thing that's happened, I think, which is that we are sort of far more quick to push the censor button rather than actually this being a kind of a state crackdown. It is, and legislatively it is, because there's more censorious pieces of law on the books. But it's also the case that I've been sort of disheartened by the support on social media and other kind of and political commentators saying, well, this really shouldn't be allowed to happen when we're talking about free speech in the public square.
I have to say that I don't think that's been as pronounced as I might have suspected it might have been. I mean, certainly all of the main kind of free speech organisations, free speech sort of pundits, all the rest of it, I think have rushed to defend these people, if anything. Because there is this idea, which I think it's important to give people, their credit for maintaining that particular principle. But it's also important to explode this idea that is on the other side of this argument, which is that everyone's a hypocrite when it comes to freedom of speech, that you're only ever really agitating to defend people you agree with. Not only is that nonsense, and it's a pretty bad case of projection, I think it's also quite dangerous because it's just, if that becomes the assumption, then you're never going to really be able to have that kind of across the different political lines sort of support for freedom of speech. People are genuinely cynical about that point to begin with. I just find it so strange that people are kind of shocked that this is happening, given the fact that that free floating culture of offence, which we now have, which kind of then gets meshed with these police powers, which even before the Policing Acts, like the Public Order Act, which a couple of people got threatened under but not properly arrested under, at least in the UK, over these Republican protests, clamps down on behaviour that can cause harassment, fear and distress or something. These are very vague concepts which can easily be weaponized or just used. And I find it interesting on the one hand that a lot of people haven't piped up about that particular law at all, even though it's also a case of Tory authoritarianism. 1986, wake of the Brixton riots and the miners' strike, these broad sweeping laws brought in. But also I think we need to hold a lot of people to account for the fact that that free floating culture of offence, which just allows any given police officer any given day to say, that's going to upset people, therefore I need to arrest you. They rolled the pitch for that, as far as I'm concerned. They've normalised it. They've demanded that the authorities play this particular role. And now they're kind of feigning surprise that it occasionally catches up with them. But of course it is. How could it not? Given, how broad and potentially like endless that kind of prohibition on speech is.
Regular viewers of the Spike podcast will know I'm not normally a fan of shaving. But for me, Harry's has been a game changer. Each razor has a carefully weighted handle which gives me more control, and their specially designed 5-blade cartridge means I can get an amazingly close shave without irritating my skin. And while I often find that shaving gel dries out my skin, Harry's has a rich lathering gel which keeps my face feeling fresh. I'm also not one to normally think about a skincare regime, but I've been using Harry's hydrating night lotion every night recently. And it must be working, as everyone keeps telling me how rested I look. Harry's is perfect for when I'm on the go too. The travel blade cover is incredibly useful. Basically, Harry's just makes shaving effortless. By having a subscription, I never even have to worry about forgetting to buy any shaving gear. And if I want to adjust or switch up any of the products I get, I can always make any changes directly from my account page. Once you start shaving with Harry's, you'll never go back. The best way to not miss out on this is with a Harry's trial set, which Spiked podcast listeners can now get for free. So, support our podcast and start your own skincare journey today by redeeming your free Harry's trial set. All you have to cover is the £3.95 for delivery. Just head to harrys.com/spiked and have your trial set and free night lotion delivered to your door. That's harrys.com/spiked.
So let's move on to some good news. The stunning fight back in Ukraine. Ukraine is currently claiming that it's captured around 8,000 square miles, or recaptured, I should say, around 8,000 square miles worth of territory back from the Russians. Tom, I mean, what's your reaction to this? Because it just is, it seems to have exploded this idea that Ukraine, not only coming from Putin, but maybe some in the West, that Ukraine should have just given up, should have sued for peace, should have, recognized the limits of what it can achieve. What have you made of it?
No, it really completely upends that particular narrative that we were just getting into, this kind of grinding stalemate, and that the ultimate beneficiaries of that were going to be Russia, and that the ability of Ukraine to properly counterattack was just going to be was just something which wasn't on the cards. I mean, it really was quite stunning, especially because of the fact that it defied so many people's expectations, including commentators in the West, but also Russia, who were caught out because for so long, obviously, it was being sort of telegraphed that this was going to be a counteroffensive in the south around Kherson. And then when all of these Russian units were obviously redeployed there to try and firm up their defenses in the north, in Kharkiv, you see this push and taking some very significant territory. Particularly people are talking about Izium and Kupiansk as two clear places which will really kind of potentially hobble Russia from here on out because of their importance logistically as kind of, feeding supplies through to their effort and all the rest of it. So it's not only the amount of land that's been taken, but also the sort of places that have now been recaptured is really, really significant. And as you say, definitely completely upsets that claim that it was all just sort of hopeless, that there wasn't going to be, that essentially, we were just sort of setting them up to fail and that they'll be fighting to the last Ukrainian and all the rest of it. It's very early days. It would be ridiculously optimistic to talk about this right now as a clear inflection point, to say that this is going to, this is the beginning of the end or anything like that.
Yeah.
But it's definitely was stunning and defied expectations, which was brilliant to see.
And it's defied expectations in Russia as well. You've seen people trying to flap around, come up with explanations. This is just a regrouping, or even you've had people to Vladimir Putin's right saying, this is unacceptable. This is, he's not being strong enough on Ukraine. What have you made of that kind of side of it?
There was a great point made by my colleague at the Battle of Ideas Festival, Jacob Reynolds, who wrote a piece for Spike this week. And actually, he was in Ukraine last week, so was sort of there when all of this was unfolding, where he says, people have underestimated Ukraine, and there's always been this narrative that there's been this sort of narrative that you can understand, which is that, okay, they can defend, but they can't attack.
Yeah.
And that Ukraine was never going to be able to match the might of the Russian army. But actually, he made the point that it's not just about the sort of the army you're wearing and the weaponry you have and how many bodies you have to fight the battle, that actually the way in which Ukraine has been fighting in terms of mobilizing an entire nation, literally all of its citizens and all of its focus and all of its sort of solidarity and support, in comparison with Russia, who has maintained this idea that this is just a kind of special operation. Don't look too closely. Don't, pretend everything's sort of just going along swimmingly despite these huge losses, has meant that actually Ukraine is in a much stronger position, or it seems so at the moment. And when you read accounts, there was a really good one that I read from a woman who went and in the kind of retreat of Russian soldiers found, just one example, found a notebook, a medical notebook that revealed that Russian soldiers were sort of reporting bullshit, as she put it, back up to the higher ranks.
Yeah.
And so then there wasn't a clear picture of what was happening at the front. And so then, that inevitably leads to miscalculation. All these sort of little things about how Russia and Putin has been sort of playing a particular kind of game that seems to have backfired in this instance of not being particularly truthful, which I think for those of us watching from abroad gives you hope in expressing solidarity with the anti-war sentiment in Russia, because there are kind of chinks in the armor there. Yeah. It's not true that every Russian is, very much paid up Kremlin supporter. And I think that's a really, that's something that Tom is absolutely right. And Jacob makes this point. Nobody start flying the bunting now or anything like that. There's discussions about nuclear attacks and all of that on the table. Whether or not that is, a likelihood or not, who knows? But anyway, it seems like this is good news, and you should celebrate your victories when they come.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there's not just talk of it being the end of the war, but also the end of the Putin regime, which seems for the moment to be getting a little bit ahead of itself. But, still good news.
No, definitely. I think that point about essentially, people have talked about this as an asymmetric fight from the off. But one kind of form of the asymmetry was the kind of will to win and to triumph, which is so much on Ukraine's side. Obviously, this is a fight for their national survival, for their national sovereignty, for their own territory. Whereas, given the fact that, at least officially according to Russia, this isn't even a war; it's a special military operation. Therefore, that has implications, meaning they can't generally just have a general mobilization. They're relying on these mercenaries and these conscripts, throwing money at people in Russia to try and actually sign up in order to fight. And so that obviously has clear impacts as well. And I think the strength of feeling of, obviously, it seems like an obvious thing to say, but it wasn't clear to some commentators, shall we say, at the beginning, really does show that this is a proper nation, contrary to what some jaded Western commentators or Putinists would say. In the stunning counteroffensive, you see a clear sense of that desire to defend themselves, defend their own communities. And in those kind of incredible videos that you see coming out of people actually for the first time in 6 months, seeing Ukrainian troops roll in and having reclaimed the territory, you see again that myth just kind of go by the wayside, that this is a proper country, and that's why it's fighting so hard to defend itself.
And it's important to note there, I mean, people will obviously say, oh, well, this is just Western weapons. They've got the might of America behind them. But as Jacob Reynolds makes this point very well, so did the Afghanistan army. They had all this fantastic, glittering American equipment.
And now the Taliban has got it.
And now the Taliban has got it.
But
if you don't have the will to use it, if you don't have if you don't believe in the nation you're fighting for, then it's pointless.
And he makes the point that in actual fact, one of the things that Ukraine and Zelensky has done very successfully is told the Americans to take a back seat when necessary.
Yeah.
And said, and there's a lot of kind of bleating going on in Washington about how important their role has been in advising the war effort and all that kind of thing. And Zelensky would probably be the first person to say hats off to the West for giving us all the kind of materials that we need. But it's very much been clear that, particularly in relation to that defiant stance of just sort of successfully obstinate sort of stubbornness in Ukraine of saying, we know the land, we know the kind of the tactics. Actually, we know the enemy better than most of you, which is a kind of a weird sort of intricacy of this battle, is that these are sort of in some ways countrymen in one way, which actually is something that's been kicked up in terms of the narrative in Russia at the moment. You've got lots of people saying, well, hang on a minute, changing tack and saying, oh, the Ukrainians are
our brothers,
that kind of thing.
Cousins of.
And all of that has meant that actually both their defense and now their attack has been more successful than if they listened to not just the kind of international relations crowd in, the West saying, oh, you'll never win, give it up, but also the sort of very cautiously approach of British and American military experts.
It's worth remembering that, at the beginning of the war, the US intelligence gave, Ukraine about 3 days to last before Kiev was going to fall. They encouraged Zelensky to get out while he could. They offered him, a helicopter out of town, and he stayed.
No, exactly. I mean, it's probably worth pointing out that, at least according to New York Times, a newspaper I obviously trust implicitly, they had an interesting piece talking about kind of lifting the lid a bit on the kind of intelligence sharing between the West, particularly the US and Ukraine, and the role that played in shaping this particular counteroffensive. There's obviously different kind of reports on that particular subject. And also, a lot of excitement about the kind of firepower that was now making its way to Ukraine, the HIMARS and all that kind of stuff. And I just wonder the people who really either hesitated or were dead against supporting Ukraine in this way. What would you rather this didn't happen?
Yeah.
Would you rather they were still in control of that territory? Would you rather that no attempt was made to at least give the Ukrainians what they need to make a good fist of it at all? I think those are important questions to ask ourselves, even though it's nowhere near over. There's all sorts of things which could be coming down the line. There's all sorts of potential for escalation as well, all that we need to take seriously. But I think that's something it's worth reflecting on, how much has at least changed for the near term right now and how much important that Western support was in it, without obviously taking the initiative away from the Ukrainians themselves, which of course is all that.
Whenever you think of the Romans, your first thought is probably of the Colosseum in Rome. But at its height, the Roman Empire stretched all the way from Hadrian's Wall in the north of England to Jerusalem, North Africa, and the Black Sea. Recently, I've been watching Travelling the Roman Empire on Wondrium. Host Darius Aria takes you on a tour of what remains of this remarkable empire through all of the stunning ancient sites that are left across Europe. It's fascinating to realise how the legacy of this great culture can still be found in so many countries across the world today. Wondrium lets us learn anything we're curious about, from history and science to languages and travel and learning new skills. And with Wondrium, you'll have unlimited access to thousands of hours of content covering any topic you can imagine. This includes audio and video courses, documentaries, tutorials, and much more. All of this is presented by top professors and experts, but there's none of the pressure of homework or grades. You can unlock this world of knowledge for yourself too, so sign up for Wondrium today and take advantage of this great offer. Wondrium is offering Spiked viewers and listeners a free month of unlimited access. To get this offer, visit our special URL, wondrium.com/spiked. Again, that's wondrium.com/spiked.
So now let's move on to Mermaids. So Mermaids is the trans youth charity that is currently in court. It's taking the LGB Alliance to court in order to try and strip it of its charity status. People who don't know, the LGB Alliance campaigns for the rights of same-sex attracted people. And there seems to be a sort of familiar pattern emerging here, that every time trans ideology, let's put it, ends up having to explain itself in court, it doesn't go very well. It's like it's logical inconsistencies get exposed under quite a harsh glare in a way that they might not.
It's such a wonderful own goal, this is. It really, if you were in any way involved in the team at the LGB Alliance, you'd just be rubbing your hands every day, because the more rope that mermaids are given, the more they look like they're so hell-bent on hanging themselves in all lines of questioning. And this is one of the ways in which Twitter should be absolutely celebrated, because you have these kind of live tweet of the tribunals. It's been fascinating to watch and read, is that in every interaction they have with lawyers, they just look like mad people. Like really, they just look unhinged. On the one hand, it's baffling because this is an organization that is obviously, has a reputation for having a certain kind of expertise in this area. And, it gives out lots of advice to particularly young people who they say are struggling with gender identity issues, who now are in court. Its representatives are continuously saying, we're not an expert. We haven't read the Cass review. We don't know anything about this. I don't know about medicine, all the stuff that reveals them as I guess not really knowing their brief. And that's on the one hand. But on the other hand, they're just simply coming out with these one-liners like, it's even kind of hard. It sort of becomes word soup. It's hard to follow, but
I think it's that John Nicholson MP one where he talks about how you're a lesbian if you decide you are one, or something like that. If you feel yourself to be one.
Yeah, or indeed
it seems to me a quite dangerous standard to set. Or indeed quite curious one as well.
It's a bit like that sort of old school prejudice against lesbian, which is just like, oh, they're just these people over there, lesbians. That's not really a real thing. And
so much so that I could just wander into that mark.
But there was also a representative who said, I can't remember who it was, who said, babies don't come out of the womb with a sex.
Yeah, this was the chair of the trustees.
Which is, just, I think anybody...
Every cell in that baby's body is sexed.
I think anybody watching the tribunal will realise what a kind of dark hole this whole kind of gender ideology stuff has gone down. And you would be forgiven for thinking this is just what a kind of weird spat in between this sort of world of sex politics and gender politics and all of that. But it's actually very important, because the thing about mermaids is they have such influence. They have such real world influence on individuals as well as organizations, that it is just a wonderful thing that they're being taken apart in public.
And such high level support from the likes of Prince Harry, from Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in the US.
A lot of those people are, if they're watching the tribunal, they're realizing stuff about this organization that they didn't know.
Or just realizing things about the ideology more broadly that is, let's be honest, is shared by a lot of these organizations rather than, caused by one of them. Tom, one of the interesting comments was this idea that it's transphobic to essentially be attracted to someone of the same sex and to exclude a trans person from your dating pool. I mean, what have you made of that? That was put forward by one of the expert witnesses.
Well, and that's one of the things that the kind of LGB Alliance side in this particular tribunal have been very good at teasing out, which is essentially the quite troubling implications of this form of trans ideology for same-sex attracted people. Effectively saying that to be attracted to someone of the same sex is in itself transphobic, because you're excluding lesbians with penises and so on and so forth. And I think that's one thing that they've done very effectively, is just to show up not just how kind of ridiculous that would seem to many people, but also how deeply troubling. I mean, you are really kind of going down a very dark road when you do that. And even the whole nature of this particular complaint, this attempt to strip the LGB Alliance of its status, similarly kind of speaks to the fact that trans ideology seems to be demanding that the ability of LGBT people to organise around their own particular interests is just in and of itself wrong. You can't do that, and that's something why there's quite high stakes around this particular case, even though it can seem like a internecine kind of spat from the outside. It's it's trying to suggest that it's wrong, improper, illegal even to have a charity which represents the interests of same-sex attracted people, and that doesn't seem to me to be a particularly progressive side.
And this is the trend that we see with gender ideology. It's not just the question of the issue of, for example, puberty blockers with kids, that obviously is quite relevant to mermaids, or other controversies around the fuss about gender ideology, but it is this fact that these people who are involved in activism around destructing the whole notion of sex aren't just interested in putting forward their own point of view. They're saying women can't do their thing when they want to, swim in Hampstead ponds alone, or any of these things.
They can't even use the word woman.
Yeah, they can't. You can't organise around sex-based things. You can't organise around lesbian, gay, and bisexual things. You have to follow our dogma. And I think that kind of brings home another level of the way in which this is all based around a kind of very censorious approach to debate. In fact, they actually say explicitly that debate about this issue is transphobic in and of itself. So it's, the fact that they are being forced by their own hand in this court case,
they launched the lawsuit
into the public realm, and being exposed and being forced to have a debate, even though, as I say, lots of their representatives on the stand are just kind of putting their hands up. I think will go some way to, it's the same with the Alison Bailey case, will go some way to, I think, shining a light on this area that has been so protected and kind of bubbled from any kind of scrutiny.
I did just want to bring it back slightly to the silliness, just because you mentioned the Alison Bailey case. We've got to talk about, one of their star witnesses who turned up insisting that they could only speak with their mother and with a support animal. I mean, this is the weird world of gender ideology, I guess, isn't it?
No, definitely. And I think, as you've both been talking about, and as you started this section with, it's under the kind of glare of the courtroom that all of this stuff gets so brutally exposed. And you do see within that how people haven't been challenged at all on any of this nonsense. That's why they go to pieces. You often feel like some of these people who are invited, not necessarily from Mermaids itself or from Stonewall itself, but perhaps just kind of well-wishers or people who are called to back them up, they don't seem to know what it is they're supposed to believe either. They've just sort of bought this very unthinking idea that this is this very progressive organisation, and therefore I trust it implicitly, whatever it says. But in a situation like this, when it is just about the cold clinical arguments, it can't stand up whatsoever. And I think we'll see more and more of these, especially if the sort of gender ideologues are going to continue to be so determined to score these own goals by pursuing groups they disagree with in the courts. And
especially if they keep bringing in their emotional support dogs.
Thank you so much for watching the Spiked podcast. We'll be back next Friday. If you hit subscribe and click the bell, you'll never miss an episode. And in the meantime, why not check out all of Spiked's other videos and podcasts on this channel? And for more Spiked content, find us at spiked-online.com.